On a sunny morning in May 2025, Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, walked through the halls of the Waldorf History Hotel in New York City. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble as he clutched his phone tightly, discussing details of the summit of African leaders that would take place the following week. The air conditioning kept the room cool in contrast to the heat he was accustomed to in Ouagadougou. "Mr. President," said his diplomatic aide, Marcel Wedriogo, approaching with a gold envelope, "an invitation has arrived for Fox News, America First, tonight. They want an exclusive interview on economic partnerships between Africa and the United States." Ibrahim stopped and looked out the 47th floor panoramic window, watching the frenetic hustle and bustle of Fifth Avenue. Yellow cars swerved between glass and steel buildings while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks. The city never slept, and neither did the challenges he faced back home. "Who will be the interviewer?" Ibrahim asked, adjusting his signature military beret. "Kash Patel," Marcel replied, consulting his notes. "Former Trump administration official, now host. He's been controversial in his views on African leaders." Ibrahim frowned. He knew Patel's reputation, a man who didn't mince words and often made controversial comments. But he also knew that this was an opportunity to show the world the new face of Burkina Faso, a country that was rebuilding after years of instability. "Accept the invitation," Ibrahim said decisively. "It's time to show who we really are." 3 days later, Fox News Manhattan studios were abuzz with activity. LED lights shone brightly on the show's blue and gold set as technicians adjusted cameras and tested microphones. The smell of strong coffee hung in the air, mingling with the perfume of makeup artists prepping guests. Kash Patel, a 45-year-old with graying hair and piercing eyes, was reviewing his notes in his dressing room. His questions were sharp, designed to put Ibrahim on the spot. On his desk were stacks of documents about Burkina Faso highlighting security, economic, and human rights issues. "Let's show these African dictators that they can't come here pretending to be saints," Patel muttered to his producer, Jake Morrison. "I have information that will leave you speechless." Across the hall, Ibrahim was quietly preparing. He was dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, but kept his military beret, a symbol of his journey and identity on. His aides briefed him on potential controversial topics. "President, he may try to provoke you," Marcel warned. "Remember, we are here to show our progress, not to engage in conflict." Ibrahim nodded, but his eyes were determined. He had faced military coups, political instability, and economic challenges. A television presenter would not be his greatest obstacle. At 8:45 p.m., the countdown began. Cameras were positioned, lights were brightened, and millions of viewers braced themselves for what would be one of the most tense interviews on American television. "Good evening, America. I'm Kash Patel, and this is America First Tonight," the host announced with his trademark smile as the theme song played. "Today we have with us Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, who has come to the United States to talk about partnerships. But can we trust yet another African leader?" The words cut through the air like blades. Ibrahim, sitting in the red leather chair, maintained his composure, but his hands clenched slightly. The studio was silent except for the barely perceptible hum of the cameras. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Patel," Ibrahim replied in fluent English, his voice calm but firm. "I am here to talk about the future, not about prejudices of the past." Kash leaned forward, his eyes shining with a mixture of curiosity and challenge. "Prejudices? Mr. Traoré, let's talk facts. Your country has one of the highest poverty rates in the world, constant instability, and now you come here asking for American investment. Why should we believe that this time will be any different?" The question echoed through the studio. Ibrahim took a deep breath, remembering the children he had seen in the schools he had built, the hospitals he had renovated, the roads he had paved. Each project was a promise fulfilled, each improvement a step toward the future he envisioned for his people. Because Mr. Patel, unlike many commentators, I don't just talk about change. I implement it, Ibrahim replied, his voice gaining strength. In 2 years, we have reduced child mortality by 30%, built over 200 schools, and created 50,000 jobs. These are facts, not opinions. The atmosphere in the studio began to heat up. The technicians looked at each other nervously, sensing that something bigger was about to happen. Kash Patel smiled predatorily like a hunter who has just spotted his prey. He shuffled through his papers deliberately, building suspense as millions of viewers waited for his next move. Nice numbers, Mr. Traoré, but let's talk about reality, Kash said, holding up a document. I have here reports from international organizations that show human rights violations under your government, arbitrary arrests, repression of journalists, summary executions. How do you explain that? Ibrahim felt his blood boil in his veins. He was well aware of these unfounded accusations spread by groups that benefited from the instability in his country. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from suppressed indignation. These are lies fabricated by those who do not want to see Africa progress, Ibrahim replied, his voice deepening. While some prefer to spread misinformation from the comfort of their studios, I am on the battlefield fighting terrorists who want to destroy my people. Terrorists? Kash laughed sarcastically. Or are they just citizens who disagree with your authoritarian policies? Because let's be honest here. You came to power through a military coup. Does that make you a Democrat? The studio became tense. Ibrahim rose slightly from his chair, his eyes fixed on Kash. The audience held their breath, sensing that the confrontation was about to escalate to another level. Mr. Patel, Ibrahim said slowly, there is a difference between serious journalism and cheap propaganda. You are crossing that line. It was at this moment that Kash Patel made the mistake that would change everything. Kash Patel leaned back in his chair, a cocky grin spreading across his face. The atmosphere in the studio was electric, cameras focusing on every micro-expression of the two men. In production control, Jake Morrison gestured nervously to the technicians, sensing that the situation was getting out of hand. You know, Ibrahim, Kash said deliberately, using only his first name to diminish presidential authority. The problem with you Africans is that you always play the victim. You come here with your hands outstretched, asking for help, but you can never properly manage even your own tribes. The word tribes echoed through the studio like a gunshot. Ibrahim froze, his eyes narrowing. In the audience, a few people let out muffled gasps of shock. Marcel, watching from the wings, covered his face with his hands, knowing that Patel had just crossed an irreversible line. Maybe it's time you guys stop playing government and let serious countries take care of real business, Kash continued, completely oblivious to the volcano that was about to erupt in front of him. After all, how many military coups have you had? It's like watching children playing adults. The silence that followed was deafening. Ibrahim stood slowly, his 6'2" height, looming large under the studio lights. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the controlled fury that came from years of dealing with this kind of colonial arrogance masquerading as journalism. Mr. Patel, Ibrahim said, his voice low but charged with authority. You have just shown exactly why America is losing influence in the world. It is not because of our inability, it is because of your ignorance. Kash, finally realizing he had gone too far, tried to regain control. Look, I didn't mean to. No, Ibrahim interrupted, taking a step toward the host's desk. You did, and now you're going to hear what a tribal African has to say. Ibrahim stood just a few feet from Kash Patel's desk, his presence completely dominating the studio. The cameras captured every nuance of his expression, the wounded dignity, the unassailable authority, and something deeper. The voice of a continent tired of being underestimated. Do you want to talk about tribes, Mr. Patel? Ibrahim began, his voice echoing clearly through the microphones. I'll tell you about my tribe. They are engineers who have built bridges across rivers you don't even know exist. They are doctors who save lives with equipment you would discard. They are teachers who teach children in 4 languages. While you can barely speak English without reading from a teleprompter, the audience was mesmerized. Kash Patel tried to interrupt, but Ibrahim continued, his passion growing with every word. My tribe produced Wangari Mai, who planted 30 million trees while you were cutting down forests. It produced Nelson Mandela, who taught forgiveness to a world thirsting for revenge. It produced scientists who discovered treatments for diseases. While you were making weapons, Ibrahim moved closer to the table, his eyes fixed on Kash's. And do you know the difference between you and me, Mr. Patel? When I speak of my people, I speak with love and pride. When you speak of yours, you speak only of fear and hatred. The studio was completely silent. Even the technicians stopped, moving, completely absorbed by the intensity of the moment. Kash Patel, for the first time in his television career, was speechless. "You want numbers, Mr. Patel," Ibrahim continued, his voice taking on a professorial tone. "In 2 years, my country has increased agricultural production by 40%. We have reduced our dependence on imports by 25%. We have created the largest solar reserve in West Africa. In the meantime, how many problems have you solved besides creating controversy on television?" It was then that Ibrahim did something no one expected. Smiled, not a smile of mockery, but of genuine pity. "Do you know what saddens me the most, Mr. Patel?" Ibrahim said, his voice now filled with a deep sadness that touched even the most skeptical viewers. "It is that you waste a platform that could educate millions to spread ignorance that divides people." Kash Patel, finally finding his voice, tried to regain control of the interview. "Look, Ibrahim, you're being too emotional here. I was just asking legitimate questions that Americans want answered. That was when it happened." Ibrahim, driven by an impulse that must have come from years of frustration with Western arrogance, took a decisive step toward Kash Patel. It was not violence. It was a show of authority that echoed centuries of African dignity being restored. "Emotional," Ibrahim repeated, his voice rising an octave. "Am I emotional when someone insults my people, my history, my struggle? Then yes, Mr. Patel, I am emotionally attached to dignity." And then came what would become known as the diplomatic slap of the 21st century. Ibrahim didn't physically touch Kash. The slap was metaphorical, but its force was devastating. He slammed his open hand down on Kash's desk with such force that the sound echoed around the studio like thunder. "Enough!" Ibrahim shouted, his voice reverberating off the walls. "Enough disrespect, enough ignorance, enough treating African leaders like beggars when we are equal partners." The impact was immediate and visceral. Kash Patel jumped back in his chair, completely shocked. The audience erupted in murmurs. In "Production control," Jake Morrison shouted confusing instructions to the technicians, unsure whether to cut to commercial or continue broadcasting this historic moment. But Ibrahim wasn't finished. He turned to the cameras, speaking directly to the millions of viewers. "America, you deserve better journalism than this. You deserve anchors who educate, not humiliate. And we Africans deserve respect, not condescension." In the minutes following the confrontation, the Fox News studio descended into controlled chaos. Jake Morrison ran onto the stage, frantically gesturing for the cameras to stop rolling, but it was too late. The moment had been broadcast live to millions of American homes, and thanks to social media was already spreading around the world like wildfire. Ibrahim stood taking deep breaths to regain his composure. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally saying what needed to be said. Marcel rushed backstage, worried about the possible diplomatic repercussions. "President, we need to get out of here now," Marcel whispered in French, trying to guide Ibrahim out of the studio. Kash Patel, still in shock, tried to regain some dignity. "Security! Security!" he shouted, as if Ibrahim posed some physical threat. But everyone in the studio knew that the only thing hurt was his ego and his credibility. "You don't need security, Mr. Patel," Ibrahim said calmly, adjusting his suit. "I came here in peace, and I leave in peace. But I take with me the certainty that I have exposed your true colors." As Ibrahim and his entourage left the studio, Fox News phones began ringing incessantly. On Twitter, hashtags such as Ibrahim Traoré, Udri, Dignitate Africana, and the Kash Patel Exposto were already among the most talked about topics. Clips of the confrontation were shared thousands of times within minutes. Outside the Fox News building, on the Avenue of the Americas, Ibrahim paused for a moment. The May evening was mild. The breeze carrying the distinctive smell of New York, a mix of car exhaust, street food, and the endless possibilities the city represented. "Marcel," Ibrahim said, looking up at the illuminated skyscrapers, "get our lawyers ready. I think Mr. Patel will find that insulting a head of state has legal consequences." 3 days after the on-set confrontation, the law firm of Wittman and Associates, located on the 52nd floor of a towering Wall Street building, was abuzz with activity. Sarah Wittman, one of the most respected international lawyers in the United States, was meticulously reviewing the program's tapes, taking precise notes on every defamatory comment Kash Patel made. "We have here a classic case of aggravated defamation," Sarah explained to Ibrahim, who was sitting in an Italian leather armchair looking out the picture window that offered a stunning view of the Hudson River. Mr. Patel's comments were not just offensive, they were deliberately calculated to tarnish his image and, by extension, the image of Burkina Faso. Marcel, sitting nearby, wrote down every detail as Sarah continued her technical explanation. "Based on American case law on cases involving international public figures and considering the global reach of the broadcast, we are talking about reputational damages in the millions," Sarah said, adjusting her glasses. "My recommendation is to sue for $90 million, an amount that reflects not only the moral damages, but also the negative economic impact that such statements could have on future investments in your country." Ibrahim nodded thoughtfully. This wasn't just about money. It was about setting a precedent. For decades, American news anchors and commentators had made disparaging statements about African leaders without real consequences. "How many times has this happened before, Sarah?" Ibrahim asked. "Many times, Mr. President. But never has there been such a forceful legal response. Most leaders prefer to ignore or issue diplomatic statements. You are changing the rules of the game." At that very moment, 10 mi away in Kash Patel's office in a less luxurious building in Queens, the atmosphere was completely different. Kash paced nervously as his lawyer, a pudgy man named Tony Ritchie, tried to downplay the situation. "Kash, you need to calm down," Tony said, loosening his tie. "It was just an interview that got out of hand. These things happen on television. Tony, have you seen social media? I'm being crucified. My show has lost 3 sponsors in 2 days," Kash shouted, gesturing wildly. It was then that the phone rang. It was Fox News' Jake Morrison with news that would make Kash's blood run cold. A week later, the federal court for the Southern District of New York was packed. Journalists from around the world crowded the steps of the imposing neoclassical building, while television cameras captured every move of the protagonists in this historic legal battle. Ibrahim Traoré arrived at the courthouse in a black limousine, wearing a smart navy suit and his trademark military beret. As he stepped out of the vehicle, he was greeted by a crowd of supporters, mostly African immigrants living in New York, who chanted and held signs with messages such as "African dignity" and "Respect for our leaders." Across the square, Kash Patel arrived in a plain yellow taxi, clearly trying to keep a low profile. His steps were hesitant, and he avoided eye contact with the cameras. Inside the courtroom, Judge Margaret Thompson, a 58-year-old black woman, known for her impartiality and judicial rigor, presided over the preliminary hearing. The air was tense as both sides presented their opening arguments. Sarah Wittman stood up confidently, her voice echoing clearly throughout the room. "Your Honor, what we witnessed was not journalism, but rather a public display of racism and xenophobia disguised as an interview. The defendant used his platform to perpetuate harmful colonial stereotypes, causing irreparable harm to my client's reputation and, by extension, to the people of Burkina Faso." Tony Ritchie, visibly nervous, tried to defend his client. "Your Honor, My client is a respected journalist who was simply asking legitimate questions about public policy. Legitimate questions, Judge Thompson interrupted, flipping through the record. Mr. Ritchie, I have watched the entire recording. Your client referred to the president of a sovereign nation and the African peoples using language that cannot be characterized as serious journalism. The decisive moment came when the judge announced her decision on the injunction requested by Ibrahim's defense. Considering the gravity of the statements, the international reach of the broadcast, and the potential harm already documented, I grant the motion for a preliminary injunction. Defendant is prohibited from making any further public comments about plaintiff until the final judgment, Judge Thompson said. But it was his final observation that echoed across global headlines. This case represents more than a dispute between two people. It represents a moment of reckoning about how public figures use their platforms to perpetuate or combat systemic bias. As Ibrahim left the courtroom, he was surrounded by journalists. His statement was brief but powerful. This is not just my case. It is the case of every African leader who has been ridiculed, of every African child who has been taught that his or her background is a source of shame, and of every person who believes that dignity has no color or continent. 6 months later, the case would be settled out of court. Kash Patel would pay $90 million, the largest defamation settlement involving an international political figure in American history. Most importantly, he would issue a public apology that would be broadcast on prime time. The money would be donated in full by Ibrahim to an educational fund that would finance exchanges between American and African universities, transforming the moment of confrontation into a bridge to mutual understanding. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Kash Patel has become a landmark, not just a legal one, but a cultural one. It showed the world that the era of impunity for racist and xenophobic comments was coming to an end, and that African dignity was no longer for sale or open to negotiation. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, a statue was erected in honor of the moment, celebrating not the confrontation, but the courage to defend the dignity of a people. The inscription on the base of the statue simply read, "When truth meets courage, justice is